Our reading today comes to us from Galatians, the book of Galatians. Recently, our lead pastor, our 담임 목사님, he's been traveling a lot, so our pastor emeritus, 원로 목사님, has been preaching quite a bit. And one of the themes that he covered was freedom, Christian freedom. Christian freedom, and it's such an important topic. I was very blessed by his words. I hope you were too. 은혜 많이 받으셨죠? We are truly blessed by his words on freedom. And it's such an important topic. We really need to talk about it a lot as Christians because we don't talk about it enough. And a lot of people, they have the wrong idea about church, about Christianity. They think that church is a prison. They make the mistake of thinking that if you become a Christian, it's all about you have to quit doing this, you have to stop doing that, you cannot do this freely, you have to change your whole life to be a Christian. They think it's all being negative, that Christianity is only about restrictions on our lives. So people have this idea, the wrong idea, of God as a party pooper. A party pooper. Do you know that term in English? A party pooper. It means someone that comes to a party and ruins it. Everyone is having fun, everyone is having a good time and laughing, and someone comes and just ruins the party. People think of God like that. A lot of people think of God like that. That they were having a good time, they were living a good life, but then God came and ruined the party. But that's not the God that we serve. That is not the God that we know. That is not the God that the Bible tells us about. As verse 1 of today's chapter says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. John tells us, if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. If the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. We are no longer slaves. We are not servants, but we are sons and daughters, set free, living in the freedom that Jesus Christ purchased for us. So church is not a prison. Church is not a prison that holds us in chains. Christianity is not a burden on our lives that we have to carry around like a backpack. It is only through the church, it is only through Christ that we can be free. True freedom comes through Christ. We were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. That is the warning that Paul gives us today. But rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. Our freedom is not an excuse to do whatever we want. That is something that we have to be careful of. Instead, we must use our freedom in love for our neighbors. Our freedom has to lead to love for our neighbors. And we can see an example of this in another book in the New Testament, in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, the church is fighting with each other. The church is fighting with each other. The church members are fighting internally. And what were they fighting about? What were they fighting about? They were fighting about food. And actually, if you look in the New Testament, there's quite a lot of times that people fight about food. But why are they fighting about food? It sounds so silly, right? They weren't fighting about who got more food. They weren't fighting about who got better food or who got to eat first. Those were other fights that the church had about food. But this specific fight was about what certain people were eating. That they were eating meat. Certain people were eating meat, 고기. What's the problem with 고기? 고기 is amazing, right? But some church members were eating meat and other church members were not happy because this meat had been offered to idols. See, Corinth was a city that was full of people from all over the world. And it was full of all different false and foreign gods, these idols. And in Corinth, some of the major temples were temples devoted to Apollo and Aphrodite, these Greco-Roman gods, Apollo and Aphrodite. And part of the meat that these temples sacrificed, because these temples would always sacrifice meat, but they took part of this meat and for profit they sold it. They put it on the market, the meat market, and sold the leftovers to whoever came and bought it. And this meat was cheaper than normal. This meat was cheaper than normal. If you go to the supermarket, you go to Home Plus or E-Mart, and you see meat cheaper than everything else, right? Special, 할인, what do? You buy it, right? It makes sense. So some Christian people said, oh, this is amazing. This good meat is on sale. We're going to buy this meat and eat it. So these Christians said, I am free. I am free in Christ. There is no other God but our God, the Father, who sent Jesus. And by Jesus, we are free to eat this meat. And we know that God made everything clean to eat, right? The vision that Peter had, everything is clean to eat. There is no restriction for us. So these people, these Christians, the strong Christians, as Paul called them, said, we can eat this meat. There's no problem. We are free. But other people in the church, they saw this and they said, no, how can you eat this meat? How can you even put it to your lips? It's disgusting. It's defiled. It's dirty. This meat has been sacrificed to idols. It is not clean to eat. And so there was a huge fight about this. And if you think about it, who is Apollo? Apollo is the Greek or Greco-Roman god, the idol of prophecy. Aphrodite was the goddess, the idol of lust. So if you go to Apollo's temple, what are they doing there? The priests there are practicing divination, fortune telling. If you go to Aphrodite's temple, what are they doing there? The priestesses there were actually prostitutes. That was how you went and worshipped at Aphrodite's temple. You paid and met these prostitutes. These are the kinds of things that were going on in these two temples, the main temples in Corinth. That's where this meat was coming from, these kinds of temples. Could there be two more unholy, evil places in the city of Corinth? Probably not. How could anyone eat food that was offered in those temples? So that's why there was this huge fight about the food. The two sides were fighting, and so they asked Paul, their teacher, Paul, give us an answer. You tell us what is right. You tell us who is right and who is wrong. So Paul answers them, and what he says is very interesting. In this letter, he speaks to the strong Christians. He doesn't speak to the weak Christians. He speaks to the strong Christians. And he describes the strong Christians as those who are free to eat meat, who know they are free to eat meat. And we might expect him to scold them. Isn't that what we would think? To eat this meat from these temples? How could you? We would think that Paul would scold them. But Paul tells them, oh, actually, yeah, you are correct. You are correct in your reading of the gospel and your interpretation of Jesus' teaching. They were right. They were right. There is nothing wrong with eating this meat. Because if you believe in the true God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who sent his son Jesus to die for our sins, then every other God, so-called God in this world, has no power. It doesn't matter if you sacrifice to them. because they're nothing, they're nobody, they're fake. So you are right. You can eat this meat. It's good for eating. You are free to eat this meat. But, and this is big but, a big but. Paul warns them, be careful, because you are right. But be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. That is what he tells the strong Christians, the right Christians at Corinth. Be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. What Paul is telling them can be described in one simple saying. You can be right and still be wrong. You can be right and still be wrong. Has anyone ever been right and they were wrong? I think we've all experienced that before. The people who ate this meat in their freedom, they had the freedom to do so. They were correct. They were right. The others were wrong. But they were wrong when they used their freedom to hurt others. We can be right and still be wrong. Paul's instruction was that it doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong. It doesn't matter who's correct, who reads the Bible better in this case. The more important thing is loving and protecting your neighbor. That is what is more important. So he told the people who were eating the meat, who were free to eat the meat, he says, actually stop. Not because eating the meat is a bad thing, but because there are other people, your neighbors, who cannot understand this. They do not understand. They cannot comprehend. They cannot take it in. And it is hurting them. It is hurting them. It is tearing the church apart, and you know it. We have to ask ourselves, what is the limit of freedom? Because we are all free as Christians, but what is the limit of freedom? 한계. The limit of freedom. The limit of freedom goes all the way up to our neighbor, but it stops there. It stops in front of our neighbor. It must not go through them or over them. Our freedom should never be used to hurt others, to be superior over them. All of us here are free in Christ. We all have this freedom, Christian freedom. There are many things that we can do without guilt. But if using our freedom means bringing harm to someone else, then sometimes we must choose to limit our freedom in that case. I think we could describe it as Christian 눈치, right? You can have a little bit of 눈치 as you live your Christian life. That not everything you can do is something you should do. In verse 13, it tells us, do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Indulge. In Korean, it says, 자유로 육체의 기회를 삼지 말고, or 말라. And when we read it this way, this indulging of the flesh, this 기회, and in other English translations it says opportunity. Do not take the opportunity to indulge your flesh. When we think of opportunity, 기회, we think of something that passes by, something that comes and goes very briefly, very quickly. That all of a sudden we have to make a split decision. What do I do? It's coming towards us so quickly. We have to make a decision. What do I do? What do I do? How to use our freedom. And this might happen sometimes. But if we look at the words here, if we look at actually the Greek word, aphorme, it literally means a base of operations. A base of operations. And this was often used in a military sense, a military base. that you used to go out and attack others. I think in Korean it's called kiji, right? A kiji, a military base. So what this means is that when we use our freedom in ways that hurt other people instead of helping them, it's not always something that happens just in one moment. We think of it that way, that it happens in one moment, but it doesn't. It's not something that we decide in just a split second. We have to look at our lives and see if we have built up this base of freedom that we use to go out and attack others. We have to ask ourselves if we have constructed and fortified over time these bases, these positions of liberty that harm others. Because that means that when we hurt others, when we use our freedom to go past our neighbor or through our neighbors, it is not something that happens by accident. It is not something that happens just in 1 second. It is something that we have been planning, we have been preparing, building this forming over time to be used in this way. It is premeditated, what they call premeditated. It means thought out in advance. And even in the world, a worldly human judge, if you go to court, they see a premeditated offense as being much worse than something that happens just in 1 second. When you sit down and plan to do something wrong, that is much worse. So we have to ask ourselves, how much more will our heavenly judge on that final day, when he sees what we have done, when he sees that we have built bases of freedom and how we use them to do violence against others, how much more harshly will we be judged? See, God has blessed us with freedom, but we must also learn to limit ourselves, to limit our own freedom out of love. And I don't think it has to be that complicated. We could think of this in very, very simple ways. When we hold the door open for someone, I know it's not a very customary thing to do in Korea, but when we hold the door for someone, do we have to? No, right? You could just go through the door and just go, huh, and then just go in by yourself. You don't have to do that thing. But when you use your freedom to hold that door, when you use your freedom to help someone with their work, you are not obligated to help someone with their work. You can just care about what you're doing. If I'm done, then I'm fine. But when you use your freedom to help someone, when you take a concern and care about other people's lives, when you have plenty to worry about in your own, that is how we can use our freedom. That is how we can use our freedom. You know, speaking of food, I actually had an experience in New York. In New York, there's a famous street food called halal. It's not the real name, but everyone just calls it halal. It's lamb and rice or chicken and rice. And it's very, very famous. But halal, for those that know, it's the Muslim version of kosher. Right? So in Muslim Sharia law, you prepare the food a certain way, and that food is halal. And it's very delicious. And there was a cart right outside our church, and a lot of our church members were going and eating. And some people, when they saw that, they could not understand it. How can you eat food that has been prepared by Muslims, that is prepared according to the Muslim law? Now, do we have to keep ourselves from eating that? Just as Paul said, you can eat whatever you want. We can eat whatever we want. This halal, we are free to eat it if we want. But for the sake of others, sometimes we can limit our own freedom. And so we actually started eating it where they couldn't see. And it sounds really silly, right? It sounds almost stupid, sorry to say. But we decided to make an effort to eat it where they could not see us. I mean, we're still going to eat it. It's really good. But we made an effort to say we love our neighbor this much that we will be concerned with how they see and how they feel these things, even if they're wrong. Even if they're wrong. It can be that simple. We use our freedom here every week. A lot of us here are serving in many different ministries. We have the freedom to just relax on Sunday. We have the freedom to do less than what we're doing now, to do half of what we are doing now. But we use this freedom, we choose to use this freedom to serve God. Because we know that even in limiting our own freedom, when we see the true love of God played out, that is when we are truly, truly set free. So the point is this: the limit of our Christian freedom is our neighbor. The limit of Christian freedom is our neighbor. We fulfill the entire law in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Because otherwise, if you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. We will be destroyed by each other. Not learn to limit our own freedoms. We do not just hurt others, we hurt ourselves. That is the important thing. It brings trouble on all of us because we're not just individuals in a church. A church is not a bunch of individuals, one person, one person, one person. But a church is a whole. It is a body made of many different parts, but it is one together as a whole. I want to tell a short story to close. As many of you know, my wife is from Chile in South America. And in Chile, if you go off the west coast, there's a very small island, far away from any land. Actually, it's one of the most remote islands in the world. It's farthest away from land of all the islands in the world. It's a tiny, tiny dot. If you look at the map, it's a tiny dot in the Pacific Ocean. And it is called Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, as some of you may know. And many of you probably know the gigantic Moai statues, right? The Moai statues, the big faces that are all around the island. These statues were built by the Rapa Nui people over 1,000 years ago. And even modern scientists and engineers, they can't figure out how these people built such massive statues using primitive tools. And as I'm sure you know, they dug in the ground under these faces, and they actually have full bodies, right? I think they go to like 30 meters tall, these statues. So they're even bigger than we originally thought. When European explorers, they first came to this island, it was back in the year 722, and they were amazed by all these statues. They were already there. They weren't built recently. They were already there for hundreds of years. But although these statues were so magnificent, it was strange that they didn't find a lot of people. There were very few people on the island. And it didn't make any sense. How could all these statues be built and arranged so perfectly, as big as they are, by so few people? So they began researching. The archaeologists, they researched what happened to the Rapa Nui people, right? They looked at the evidence in the ground. And they found evidence that the island had once been home to thousands and thousands of people. And these people lived very well. There was great abundance. And they had good technology for their time, but the record shows a drastic change in the island. The Rapa Nui people, they became obsessed with building these moai statues. And so they started competing. They say, who can build the biggest, the best, the most beautiful moai statue? It's going to be me and my family. So in their competition, they started cutting down all the trees on the island. And what we have to understand is when we cut down all the trees, it's not just trees being gone and the oxygen they create, but there's a lot of other changes that happen to the land as well, which is why it's so important to protect our forests. They cut down all the trees, and this changed the island's ecosystem. And so there was a severe drought. Nothing would grow on the island anymore. And so they cut down all the trees. They ran out of trees. They ran out of food. They couldn't build any more statues. So what did they do? They said, well, we can't build any more statues, so let's go around and knock other statues over, right? So what happens if you wake up in the morning and someone knocked your statue over? So you go to your neighbor's house and you knock their statue over because it was probably them, right? So the people started fighting each other. There were wars over these statues and wars over the food and the resources because they had so little left. They started fighting over everything. And eventually there are records of them even becoming cannibals and eating each other because they had no food. There was no food left on the island. They had these beautiful statues, but they had no food, and they started eating even each other. You know, we think Paul is talking in a metaphor when he says, if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed. But the Rapa Nui people, this really happened to them. They lived out these words. And you know, starting out, I'm sure they said, oh, well, we're not doing anything bad. These statues are good. I'm going to build a majestic, beautiful statue. And then the next person said, well, I am free to build a bigger one. And the next person said, I am free to build the biggest statue you've ever seen. And so it went, one after another. They abused their freedom. And it continued until their entire civilization, this entire island, was destroyed in their desire to practice their freedom. So this island, which once had thousands and thousands of people, at one point shrank to 100 people. 100 people on this island. You know, now they're living much better. They're part of Chile. There's thousands of people there. But at one point, there were only 100 people left on this island. This is the end result of freedom that is followed with no limits, with no love. A freedom without limits and without boundaries. It might sound nice. It might sound appealing. You know, in America, they talk about freedom nonstop. But even freedom must have limits. That is what God wants from us. So as we close our message today, let us carefully consider this freedom that we have. I hope and I pray that we would not use our freedom as a base, that we build up this freedom as a base to hurt and attack others. Let us not premeditate how to harm our neighbor, but instead let us limit ourselves in love. Let us practice this Christian freedom, this Christian 눈치 of knowing where our limits should be. And in doing these things, we will fulfill the law of Christ, the law of love. Even Christ himself had freedom, but gave himself up on the cross to die for us. He had the freedom not to, but he did. This is the love that we must show to our neighbors as we humbly serve one another.